All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Looks great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about troubleshooting anything. And I mean this specifically as in anything from a very high level. I'm going to try and go pretty fast here. I'm going to throw out some examples and I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of details and things at you. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. So the why. Why do we care about troubleshooting as a whole? Why do we care about it as a process or a thing that we're considering? And also, I'm going to point out right now, I cannot see anywhere where if anybody's hands are raised. So if you have questions that you want to ask in the process, please shout them out at me. Or maybe Kyler can take a note of hand raises and tell me. Either way. All right, so why do we care, right? So troubleshooting comes very naturally to some people. And like we'll talk about in just a second, to other people, it's kind of trained. And based on how you're trained to troubleshoot, kind of interprets or helps interpret your view of the way that you're working through a technical process. But this sort of troubleshooting pattern can be applied to anything beyond technical. I mean, you can apply it to fixing a car. You can apply it to a baking recipe. You can apply it to doing your development or doing something operations heavy or even teaching your child how to do something very basic, right? Troubleshooting is a sort of state of mind that you're working through and not necessarily the aspect of how you're going to do something, which is why one of my most important questions during the interviews that I've had is I ask the interviewee, how do you troubleshoot? How do you get through this end to end? And clearly, I'm very passionate about the subject. I've taught troubleshooting at a couple other corporations in the past. I've held my own initiatives to teach people how to troubleshoot with just using CLI-based tools and not having to do click hops getting into environments. And I've actually spent quite a bit of time doing presentations around how do you get into that thought process of troubleshooting and how do you apply it to more than just one thing. So this is something I'm very passionate about, and I think if you've worked with me and troubleshooted with me in the past, especially with some of those conversations that we've had with Microsoft, where they take the approach of deny, deny, deny until you prove them wrong. Sometimes it's just about hacking away at it over time, and this process really helps keep us on track. So problem solving versus troubleshooting. What does it mean and what is the difference, right? So problem solving is the concept of taking the problem that's in front of you and applying a solution to that problem. Once you've solved your problem, that's it. You walk away, that's the end of it. Troubleshooting adds a lot more than just problem solving. Problem solving is the result of having to go through that troubleshooting as a whole. So troubleshooting adds process to it, having steps along the way, making sure you document, making sure you have follow-ups, making sure that you're tracking and trending what you're doing and what other people are doing, all falls into that troubleshooting process. Troubleshooting, again, adds that follow-up, right? After we've made a change or done something, what do we do to make sure that it doesn't happen again? And again, troubleshooting is that byproduct. So what can be troubleshot? And yes, that is the correct plural or perfect past or whatever it's called tense. So many different tenses, but troubleshot is a word. Yes. How do you identify, can something actually be troubleshooted, right? And the very most basic thing that you start with is, can we define the problem? Can we actually define the issue at hand? If we can't define the issue, there's no way you're going to troubleshoot it. If somebody just says, intermittently, I get dropped. Okay, we can define at least portions of that, right? It's intermittent and you're getting dropped. How are you getting dropped? And other details we can further define. But at least the problem has to have some ability to be defined. It can't just be something completely ephemeral. We have a problem and we have no idea what or where it is. And along with that, understanding versus acting. So there's an element in troubleshooting of understanding the concepts, understanding the architecture, understanding the engineering, and then acting on it, right? So just because you understand it doesn't necessarily mean you know how to always act on it. And sometimes that, especially in larger organizations, that responsibility may fall onto different teams and different people in different places. So it's important to consider our source of knowledge and our education into how we think and what our patterns are, especially when it comes to diagnosing an issue or working with other teams and other team members across the company. So for example, traditional collegiate versus technical education versus somebody being self-taught, right? Those are your general three paths that you find most people fall into inside of our company. Traditional collegiate is probably one of the bigger areas, right? And in traditional collegiate design models, they're never focused on this is how you build a thing and this is how you do a thing and this is how you troubleshoot a thing. They're usually focused on the larger and much broader, this is how we generally do things. These are the best practices in the industry. This is why we write loops this way instead of this way, or what have you, right? It's generally a lot more basic and broad, but it is that foundational layer underneath where you're actually starting that knowledge from. Often from there, people will either dive straight down into that technical education with either on-the-job training, certifications that they're earning, things that they're working through or whatever. But that technical education is really focused on how do I accomplish a thing? How do I technically get from point A to point B and eventually to point C, D, E, F, and so on, right? And in that technical aspect, it's not so much about what are the bases and what's the rest of the industry doing and how are they all doing it and what's the best way to do it. It's more about how do you just accomplish that goal, right? Self-taught is yet again another realm where you think a little bit differently. And with self-taught, people are usually learning from others or learning from documentation or learning from DIYs, tutorials, etc., where it's more of a top-down learning aspect. You're learning how to do a thing, not necessarily how that thing works in the componentry of the rest of the bigger picture. And that usually leads to, okay, I built a thing. I understand how to build a thing. I understand when I have this problem with this one thing, but I may not understand if this problem causes something else due to a different change. How does that chain reaction happen, right? So it's never just one aspect that's best. You kind of have to have a mix of all three, and that's the experience that people get over time. So after you've had one of those forms of education and you're spending some time learning and teaching or doing by yourself or following DIYs or whatever, that application of that knowledge starts to become a little bit more consistent, and that understanding starts to turn into acting, or the constant acting turns into adding understanding to it. So that's where that last bullet point is there, putting understanding to action or adding understanding to action. It's an important aspect of it, but it's also important to note that different teams do work differently and different people on different teams do work differently. So just because you see the view in a particular way doesn't mean other people don't see other things that maybe you don't see, or you see things that maybe they don't. So it's just important to consider the background a little bit. So again, troubleshooting as a multi-org enterprise. We have a lot of different teams, and a lot of teams are responsible for different things. So you have support responsible for that client communication and that initial touch base from the client saying, my thing is broken and it doesn't work. And it's up to support to start identifying, well, what is that thing? Who's impacted? How many people are impacted? Where are they impacted? Who is this client that's calling me, right? All those levels of details and things that they have to put together is the starting point of a lot of our foundational what is broken and how do we get there to fix it. And if we're missing pieces of that, we're not able to work together in order to get to that final answer. So it's important for us to have handoff points and responsibility delineations in areas. So if support is responsible for getting all of that information from the client initially, right, that's a handoff point for them. When they've gotten all of that information, they can start handing off to other technical people that are working in the environment to start putting that information together and start making better use of it. And then another point there is you're never helpless. It doesn't matter if you do or don't have access to an environment. Just visually seeing something that's going on, or saying, hey, I've got a whole bunch of tickets that are suddenly coming in and clients are complaining about the same thing repeatedly. This seems like a bigger issue than just one client complaining about one thing, right? So you're never helpless. Things that you notice and see are usually relevant and helpful, especially if it leads into a larger issue. So if you've seen something or you've noticed something, or you see an error or an alert or something that you think might be related, it's always best to just raise your hand and say, hey, I think this could be related to the issue at hand. Maybe we can use this. All right, so let's talk about general steps and where do they come from. So general troubleshooting, if you look it up, is defined by different certification bodies, generally about the same, slightly differently. I took the CompTIA one and basically just pasted it into here because it's one of the more commonly understood and known ones. And that CompTIA certification that people have gone through for troubleshooting specifically is one of the more broadly accepted ones in the industry. But it's still relatively high level. And I like to break it down a little bit further than CompTIA actually has, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. But generally from CompTIA and most of these certification bodies, they're following the same pattern of identify a problem, identify a theory for the probable cause, test that theory, establish a plan to put in a resolution for that theory, implement the solution, or escalate if you're stuck, verify, and then document your findings, right? That's fine. That all works very well, and it's very accurate, and it's totally on point, right? It makes a lot of sense. However, I'd like to summarize that a little bit further. And the big reason of why is because healthcare is a little bit different. Big enterprises like ours are quite a bit different. And these steps, although they are succinct and they are correct and they are relatively correctly spaced and processed, right? The problem with them is that they are just kind of wordy and complicated for most people to just understand right off the bat or remember right off the bat. I had to go look it up to copy and paste this list. And I've taught this kind of course a couple of times in the past. So making sure that we understand that it can be simplified and it doesn't have to be completely boilerplate is also an important part of it. And also with healthcare, we have that delineation between responsibility of different groups. So it's important to know where we have that delineation, especially when it comes to change control and implementing our changes and the possibility and scope of the impact of the changes that we're going to put in. So let's break that down a little bit, right? I break it down into 4 basic steps. The first of those steps is define the problem. And you can see here I highlighted where I'm kind of taking that from CompTIA. So they say identify the problem, and then at the end they have document your findings, right? I don't think the documentation needs to happen at the end. I think we should be documenting along the entire way. So you'll see that highlighted all the way through. But defining the problem is a relatively simple first step, right? We have to be able to understand what the problem at hand is. So we ask questions around that. And I'm not going to read off everything here, but the general aspect of it is ask the questions to define the problem. How many and where of the people or end users are impacted? What's impacted specifically? Is it a service? Or is it end users? It is a function within an application? Is it some internal function? Can it be reproduced? Are there workflows? Is it persistent, intermittent? Just anything you can think of to basically narrow down that problem field into a scope that you're concerned with and into a pattern that you can follow. And probably the most important aspect of it is, can you reproduce it? Can we find a way to consistently reproduce? That way, if we're throwing errors, we can have consistent errors to track. And is there a workflow for reproducing that effort? Is it part of the login process that's failing? Is it part of a specific button that they click in the application and suddenly it's failing? Is it an interface that's failing, right? The more we can identify that workflow, especially up front, and the more we can identify the reproduction of the issue, especially up front, the faster we can get to defining our next steps. So once we've defined the problem, then it's up to next steps. And let me talk about a quick example here. So originally, I had a more complex example, but I decided to back that down into a simpler one from earlier this year. So we had a major incident that was called for a client down, and I saw the incident pop up. I didn't join the incident immediately because it didn't seem like a network issue immediately, but it said support had noted that specifically provider lost access rights to EHR, right? In my mind, my first thought was, okay, it could be a licensing thing. Or something like maybe there's just a user or a set of users that forgot their credentials or something's going on with this client. Doesn't seem like a network issue. I'll walk the other way, right? However, it continued. The MI continued. People continued to troubleshoot, and then it came out that the users are unable to access their accounts through the portal. Okay, well that's starting to sound more like they're not able to get in through the front end somehow. So it seems like it could be networky. That's when my team got involved and we started asking some questions around, was there a specific error? Is there anything that we're getting up front that would tell us where this problem might be? And the quick response was, we got a 502 bad gateway. So if you're a network person or you think like a network person like I do, 502 bad gateway to you means where I'm sending to is wrong. Something is wrong to where I'm trying to go, right? And usually it's going to be at a load balancer, at a firewall, at a handoff point somewhere in the network where it's expecting to hand off that communication to the next level, oftentimes load balancers, or right behind load balancers. So coming back to the next step there is investigate and document. So after we've defined the problem, let's investigate the problem itself. And this is where I've condensed quite a bit of the CompTIA design, right? So establish a theory, test the theory, establish a plan of action for resolution, right? And all this repetitive circle. I wanted to kind of highlight also, if you see here, this theory, test, result circle diagram. Basically, you start with a theory, you test that theory. If it doesn't work, then you move on and you start with another theory and you test again. And you're recording your results and the impact each time. And again, because we are a HIPAA-based company, we have healthcare that we deal with, we have a lot deeper change control that we deal with than some other companies and industries do. We want to make sure that at every step in this process, we're documenting what we're doing. Because it might be that a particular theory and a test that we do actually solve something else, and it may be a problem or it may be a solution that we want to leave in for a different problem that we had that we magically solved along the way, and that has happened. Or maybe none of the solutions that we've tested so far are actually getting us to the end result, and we want to document what we tried. That way, if anybody else follows up behind us down the road, they have an idea of what did we try and why, and did we fail because there was something wrong for trying, or did we fail because it was just a step and it checked out okay, right? But the point here is that theory, test, result is a circle that'll keep going until you identify where the actual problem is and you have a much greater certainty that that implementation of that solution is exactly what's going to fix your problem. So in our specific, okay, I kind of went through this. So investigating document, again, novel or complex issues, even non-fruitful things should be documented. Screenshots are incredibly helpful. Theories need to be testable. So just because you have a theory doesn't mean that it's going to be a valid thing to implement to try and resolve an issue. There has to be some way of testing it afterwards to say, oh yeah, this thing that we implemented did or did not do what we expected it to do. And that might be as simple as solving the problem, or that might be more complex if there's a series of things that need to be done. And again, changes without positive net effects should be rolled back. And then obviously working end to end. So once you've identified a pattern and a flow, you're trying to work through the workflow, or you're trying to work end to end in the architecture to understand where the break and where the problem is. In our specific example, right? So once NetOps identified, okay, bad gateway, there's got to be something either pointing across the network or an endpoint that's not responding correctly, or something going on here. Let's start from the front and let's trickle our way down through the architecture and talk through it. So to narrow down a problem, we started at looking at the basic resource health on the backend servers. So this was, can the team that was already looking at the servers, can they actually get into them, and can they launch the sites locally to get to them? And in fact, they could. Everything came back healthy. The servers looked fine. When they launched locally, everything looked okay. And this is where NetOps got a little bit more deeper engagement. We started walking through the firewall. We verified the configs there. We verified the load balancer config looked healthy. And then as soon as we hit the app gateway, we identified, oh, look, there's a backend pool here that's just showing completely unhealthy. And if that backend pool on the app gateway is showing completely unhealthy, it has no destination to send your traffic to. Therefore, the app gateway will throw a 502 bad gateway error at you. Makes sense. Comes back to our error. Okay, we've identified where the issue is. But at the same time, we've done other things like verify. Oopsies, that went way faster than it was supposed to. So we've done other things along the path, right? We tested the firewall. That wasn't fruitful, but we were able to see the config and that it was set correctly. So that's an important thing to note. The internal load balancer wasn't a part of the issue in this case. However, we did check it. And while it wasn't fruitful, we do know that it was set correctly. So those, again, important thing to note. The app gateway, obviously, that's going to be where our solution is. So get to the next steps here, and that's identify and test a resolution. So we've identified the area that we are very confident this problem would have a solution in. We want to come up with a plan to implement that solution. So in this case, it was my team's ownership. If it was a different team, I would write up a recommendation and then go to that other team and say, hey, this is where I think the issue is. This is where I see the problem. This is how I would recommend you solve the problem if you were to take a look at it. This is, your responsibility if your team owns it. So I'm handing this off to you. But I would hand over all of that information, all of my screenshots, all of my details, everything that I have together, so that I'm not setting them to start from zero. I'm hopefully setting them to start at 60, 70, 80, 90% or wherever. And in this case, it was NetOps that owned it. So We identified what the most likely resolution was going to be, and that's fixing the app gateway config. We scheduled that time to implement that solution because the client was seeing impact. That meant immediately. And then afterwards, one, we verified that the website was actually working and getting hit. And then two, we verified that support was able to log into the application. And then once they were able to log in and they confirmed they were okay, then they could contact the client and start telling the client to get back in and start doing their own testing as well. And that was in our specific example. The backend pool needed to be corrected. And then once it was, the error went away. And it was also visible in the Azure portal on the App Gateway health status. When you look at it, that suddenly the nodes are healthy. But the key points there are we have to identify a test plan. We have to document what that change is going to be, put in any tickets or anything that we need. Obviously, if it's high priority, it just needs to be done. But we should still strive to document that ticket, or at least document the details for that ticket so we can document the ticket after. And of course, test everything that we do. All right, and then here comes the last portion of this. So the last portion is really what I like to call the other, and it's everything else that you've done up to the point of actually testing and implementing a solution and identifying where issues might be. So in this particular case, and I'll go through that in a little more detail, but we had some preventative measures that we could implement. We had some details for our team that was a better thing for us to note. And we had to put some documentation together so that not only our team, but other teams were aware of a process for communicating when changes occurred, especially that might impact other portions of the environment. And the things that you should think about in the other category, like I've solved this problem, I fixed the thing, I've done troubleshooting, right? Not exactly. The things that we want to consider in this scenario are, is there an appropriate long-term solution? Or is the fix that we put in the permanent fix and it's just going to be good after this and we should document it as shouldn't be a problem again? Is there an interim fix? Is there a run book or something that needs to be done in the short term until a permanent fix can be applied to prevent user impact? Can it be automated if it's repetitious? If it's something that we can alert and trigger on from the environment, can we set an automatic response? Because if we can monitor it, there has to be a way to have an automatic response to it. And if we can have an automatic response, then it's handoff. And we just want to document that it's happening, not necessarily that somebody has to go in and do it. Can it be part of our infrastructure as code or config related in some capacity? Is it something that we can just implement at a ground layer so that new deployments aren't affected? And this is especially applicable to like new environments being built that may experience an issue right out of the gate, right? And then what's the best way to pass on this knowledge for this issue? Maybe it's just as simple as people need to share this information among their team, maybe through team notes or a Confluence page or just conversation and education among each other. Maybe it's just a thing where we sit down and we talk about how does this actually work in order for everyone to feel comfortable and understand the general issue at hand. In our specific example, what ended up happening was actually we were troubleshooting a completely different issue for a completely different client, which was, to our knowledge at the time, the only client that was using that system, this new environment that was built. After troubleshooting that issue, we had to make some changes to the application gateway. In order to make these changes, and we did so in order to isolate the flow to a single server instead of having the application gateway sent to a pool of servers. But as a result of changing that server and having the L3 team also isolate the receiving gateway on their side, it meant that only some of the gateways, specifically one out of the three that was in the pool for the other client that was also on the same app gateway, 2 out of the 3 weren't working, right? Because they were taken out of load on the back end. And that's really where the issue came in, is that it kept getting unhealthy checks as soon as that application gateway would get hit. And one of the servers wasn't actually taking load to begin with anyway, so all 3 were not working. And that's where the client was stuck. So our issue in this particular case was pretty easy to solve. It was just an app gateway change, make sure that the nodes in the load balancer pool are correct, get them configured correctly, make sure that they're doing the correct health checks, make sure that they're firing back with health checks correctly, and then the site should just work, right? That's the magic of application gateway. It just works. However, because there was this other client that caused us to do this troubleshooting, and we weren't aware that this client was live yet, we caused the impact ourselves in this scenario. So moving forward, we all just needed to do a better job communicating among each other between our team and the team doing the build out of the new client, that the client was in fact going live on a particular date. Because part of the issue there was this client kept getting moved out and out and out and out. And we had assumed that it was the following month. Turns out it was that weekend. And on Monday morning, we started having issues, unfortunately. But it just highlights the fact that, especially in a larger organization, communication is incredibly important, especially in the aftermath of issues like this. And that's part of why we have those weekly on Fridays MI review meetings where we'll talk through what do we need to do better. But it's also why having this documentation up front and having it with you as part of your troubleshooting process is so helpful, because then you get into that MI review meeting and you say, okay, well, we've done all these things, and this is how I think we need to move forward with it. And that gets us 90% of the way there, just by having those details together. All right. So coming to the end here, putting it all together. 4 basic steps that we've defined in this, which is define the problem, investigate and document, resolve and verify, and then follow up on everything else in that other. And obviously the investigate and document and resolve, that can potentially go through a circle until you eventually get to the right resolution. Oftentimes we end up testing 1 or 2 things, figure out that's not getting us to the answer that we want. Let's test a few more things. Let's keep testing. And eventually you find something that is in fact the real resolution, or the most likely resolution. And that's when we get to those next steps and following up afterwards. But you may get stuck in that middle part. So don't necessarily worry about getting stuck there, just as long as you have a plan to move forward, meaning you have a next theory and you have a next test plan. And if you don't, then the next best thing to do is escalate and move it up to somebody else. Okay, I talked a lot. I talked really fast. Who has questions for me, or thoughts, or anything you'd like to share?